practicing being kind to another version of ourselves helps us practice being kind to like the current version of yourself that's trying to make something. It's really hard to make things.
Yeah.
I think the more compassion we can have, right, the more supportive it is.
Welcome to the podcast, Tapping Creativity, with myself, Matthew C. Temple. And each week, we're going to dive into questions and issues and inspiration around creativity and the creative process. Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Tapping Creativity. This week, we have a special guest, which I know I say that all the time. I know, and that's true. I actually only have special guests, so that's one of the really fun things about doing what I do. Not only do I get to talk to great people and get to share with you now as well some of the insight and wisdom that they have pulled in through their creative process, but I also get to read a lot of great books. I get to watch a lot of great movies. I get to listen to a lot of great music. And in this case, I got to read Catchlight. And Catchlight was written by Brooke Adams Law, who is joining us today. She is the author of this novel, won the Fairfield Book Prize, and was named a Best Indie Book of 2020 by Kirkus Review. She's also a writing coach, helping new writers step into their author identity and write the book that wants to come through them. So really excited to have you here today on the show. Welcome, Brooke.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Whenever I see someone holding up my book, I'm just like a fangirl.
Well, we'll screenshot that. We'll do this.
Yes, I love it.
Okay. I really love, been really appreciating the book. I haven't quite gotten to the end. I got it a couple weeks ago, but I am blazing through it. And one of the things that really jumped out at me was really just how authentic the characters came through, how wonderful the dialogue is. Dialogue is a particularly challenging thing to write, and it's through the dialogue you get to know them and their really individual voices, and it makes for a very compelling read. So congratulations on that. I want to talk a little bit more about your book, but first, tell me what got you into this line of crazy work.
Yes. Oh my gosh. And thank you so much for those kind words about the book. So I feel like I've wanted to be a writer since I was like 4 years old, and I started learning how to like write the alphabet. And so my mom tells the story that I would just like be like, I want to write. And so she would just dot out like pages and pages of words and like little sentences for me. And I would just like trace them over and over. And I remember that compulsion at like 4 being like, I have to learn how to do this. And ever since then, right, I feel like it has not changed, right? So I remember writing sort of a fantasy story when I was in 7th grade, and I entered it into like a library contest, and it won the contest. And they had it bound in like a hardback little book, and you can still check it out, of the Huntington Valley, Pennsylvania library. And so my 12-year-old self was like, I want more of this, right? So one of the stories that I often tell about writing Catchlight is like, it's this story of just like persistence, like just like keeping going, right? Because the book took me like 7 years to write, and then it took me 6 more years to get it published. And I was just like relentless. I was just like, I'm not going to stop.
That is not an uncommon scenario, which I think can be pretty tough, because first of all, writing a book is hard enough. Writing a good book is even harder. And then I forget who it was that said something to the effect of, don't worry about anybody stealing your work. If you do really good work, you're going to have to work your butt off to get anyone to even look at it.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, it's kind of true.
It's like, yes, the challenge of doing great work and then getting work out there. And it's like, oh, but I've done this already, right? And so what was that like then? Because obviously as a writer, you want to be able to keep writing, but then a ton of energy goes into that other part of this. So how did you sort of balance those two things to keep your creative self engaged while also doing all that annoying stuff like sending out query letters?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think part of it became because at the time this is years ago now, I was working at like a full-time job and I had a really long commute. And so I was spending a lot of time like sending query letters and like trying like pitching small publishers and the whole bit. And finally I like took a break and I put the book in a drawer for a little while because I was like, I want to have time to like write my own stuff. And I hadn't figured out, I think, how to do both. And I think now I'm in a much different place. Like I run my own writing coaching business, but I also have 2 kids, right? So that's different than when I wrote the first book. And so what I've done now is because I still am doing, right, some marketing for Catchlight, and I still do marketing for my own business, right, and like actual work and other things. So what I do now is I've found that for me, like I really have to be in my own book every day, especially because I write fiction. I don't know if other authors feel that way, or like I've talked to a lot of folks who write nonfiction where it's like they don't have to be in it every day. They could like sit down for a couple hours and write and then like take a week off. But like if I'm not in the book a little bit every day, I sort of like lose touch with it. And so what I found that works really well for me is I do like this like mini word count goal. And so right now it's 200 words a day. And it sounds so small as to be like kind of insignificant. And also like I've been writing 200 words a day every day for probably like 8 months. And so I did a little bit before that, right? So I have like 100 pages, right? I'm like, oh, it feels really good now, 120 pages or whatever it is. So, yeah, I think for me, like having that practice of just like, I get up at like, I do my thing, I get my kids to school, and then I have kind of a ritual I do before I start writing, and I do my 200 words, and then I kind of carry on with whatever else needs to be done. But having that routine has been really supportive.
You know, most people who aren't doing this full time have to find a way to put all the pieces together, and it becomes obviously pretty challenging. And I think the other thing that I'm particularly interested in around some of your creative trauma healing work is that, you know, there's also this idea that, oh, if I had more time, I would be able to do more of this work. And quite honestly, creative work is such personal, transformational work that you can't do it full time. You know, like even, I mean, there are some people who do, but you know, I've spent most of my professional career as a filmmaker. You're not making movies full time, like all the time. You don't go 9 to 5 to make movies. It's simply impossible. That the creative work, the in-breath, the outflow, all of that stuff, it needs to be in a type of harmony. So I want to talk to you a little bit about that, but I just want to also really shine that spotlight. 200 words is actually like just phenomenal. It's like if everybody who's dreamed about making something said, you know what, rather than trying to think I need to blow up my life or lament the fact that I have to go to a 9 to 5 with a long commute, if we could just be like, actually right now, what you have is the perfect situation in order to write your next book or make your next movie or do whatever. You have exactly the right amount of time. You, in this case, have just enough time for 200 words a day. Rad, right?
Yes. I love this so much. And there's a few things. So one thing, yes, when I was doing my long commute and it was awful, it was like 2 hours each way on the train. And what I would do is like, and this was back in like, oh God, like 2013. So my laptop at the time weighed like 20 pounds, right? So I was not lugging that thing like back and forth every day to New York City. But what I would do is I had a spiral bound like notebook, and I would just handwrite. I handwrote most of Catchlight on that train. Like, and I would only do it in the morning, right? Because by the afternoon I was like totally shot. But it was like, I just made this decision, like I'm going to keep committing to it. So I love what you said about like, right, wherever you are, whatever your situation is, right, you have exactly enough time to make the thing, like just in this little whatever bit of time. And the other thing that I wanted to say, and I loved what you said about right, like you're not making movies full time, right? It's really hard to do like full creative artistic work, like quote unquote full time. And I had this realization just the other day that the time that I spend actively writing, right, so those 200 words a day, it's like the tip of the iceberg of what it takes for me to like write a book, right? And all the things that are under the surface are like getting enough sleep and eating healthy meals and like doing things that fuel like my creative ideas and like eavesdropping on people in coffee shops again, right? Like all those pieces sort of go into, right, like what shows, like what it looks like I'm doing when I'm like typing words into the computer, right? So yeah, I love that so much.
So before we jump into some of this other stuff that we were talking about, and you just said you eavesdrop and whatever, in this particular book, in Catchlight, one of the things that jumped out at me was, like I said right at the beginning, the dialogue felt very authentic. The situations, what the therapist is going through, dealing with a mother with Alzheimer's, and that's rapidly progressing or degressing, as it were. What is your relationship to these characters, their situations, their professions, the alcoholism, like all these pieces? What are your relationships to that? Is this all fiction, like fantasy? Does it have some relationship with things that you've experienced, or has it really come through, research and listening to people on the train?
I love this question. So my grandmother had Alzheimer's when I was in college, and so she died of complications due to Alzheimer's when I was like 22. So I remember that summer I was reading this book. It's a little known book by Madeleine L'Engle, who's really famous for A Wrinkle in Time, but one of her kind of books for more adult readers is called A Severed Wasp. And in that book, there's a character who is in her 80s. And this character was a concert pianist for her whole life. And so she traveled the world, and she had a crazy story. Like, she was a prisoner of war during World War II, right? She had all these big experiences. And so when she's like 80 something, she comes home to New York City, where she was raised. And she is on purpose, like, making peace with her memories and sort of making meaning of, like, what has my life been about? And a big part of it is like processing pain that she like didn't take the time to process kind of in the moment when it happened. And she's really sort of like, going through. So it's a lot of it is told in flashback, but then a lot of it is her like processing it through her music and through like conversations with friends. And I remember thinking, like, what happens if you get to the end of your life and you don't get to do that? Right. So what happened with my grandmother is, like, what if what happens is actually the opposite? Like, you start losing your memory instead of like processing it, right? Like, you're actually kind of losing your identity. And so I started asking myself, right? So I had been away at college most of the time that my grandmother was sick, and I would visit her. But I really started wondering, right? It was my dad's mom. So my dad is one of 6 siblings, and they do not always get along as adult siblings often do. And I just started asking myself this question, like, what would it have been like to be a fly on the wall, right? In some of those like conversations and, right. And so, and I just started like wondering, like, what was it really like to kind of experience that, right? And I experienced it like once, like kind of maybe twice removed, once by generation, once by distance. And so I really started imagining like this family that I was having a similar experience, but I sort of created the characters just out of my imagination, right? So some people who know me think that they see themselves, and it's really not them, right? So it's like I really sort of made up these characters. And also, like, one thing, one family member said to me, she was like, I know that they're not based on anyone, but they feel familiar, right? So like she had this sense of like there were certain situations, right, or things that were, we knew someone, or right, like just like they could kind of recognize things that kind of came through in my life. So, but it was mostly kind of imagined, like, what if, right, this situation that my family went through, if this made up family was going through it, right, what does it look like? And I will say there's a lot of alcoholism on both sides of my family. And so I've seen it kind of up close, and I've seen it like kind of through different lenses, and I've seen how people don't talk about it. And I really wanted to have a character who was kind of living that out, and to be able to see it kind of both from inside his own mind, right, because he's a narrator, and then also, right, from how his siblings see it as well.
How long did it take you to go from I'm writing my first word to I have gone through my process, I've had beta readers, I've gone through all that thing, and I put the final touches on it when I felt like it was ready to be submitted?
Yeah, it took 7 years. And a lot of that time I wasn't writing the whole time, right? So I started it the summer I graduated from college. And I mean, so in those 7 years, like, I moved 3 times and I got married, right? There's like a lot of things were happening, but I would say like 7 years from the first idea to like, it's pretty much done, right? And then there was another 6 years when it got published. I did like one more pass at it, and like my editor had some suggestions, right? But it didn't change kind of substantially after that. After the first 7 years, it didn't change substantially.
It was all grown up at 7.
Right.
So I love it. So let's talk about how when we first started communicating, one of the things that you said, this work that you're doing is in trauma healing work around the creative process. And you said you often work with writers or and creators, primarily writers, I guess, and healing those wounds that crop up. And you said it could be perfectionism, procrastination, feeling boring or whatever. So basically, imposter syndrome, this type of thing, right? And so you have this idea that we have these creative wounds, and I'm really kind of curious how those are unique or different from any other wounds that people are carrying, or are they different?
As I'm working with more people, I'm starting to see like there's a slight distinction between, creative wounds that I think, wounded our ability to create things. And then there's also like wounds and trauma that we experience that sometimes we want to write through, like to use writing to heal those other things that happen. And those those different types of wounds kind of interact, in interesting ways. And so one thing that I see and that I work with folks on, is this idea of creative wounds. And I first got like the glimmer of this idea reading The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron like 10 or 11 years ago. And she talks about this idea of creative monsters, that we all have like someone who has kind of been like this monster. And so I feel like I've sort of been practicing taking that even deeper of like what are the wounds underneath, And so I think we all have had, every single person has had the experience of making something and it wasn't received the way you hoped it would be. And so it's not always like criticism, because sometimes it's silence, It's like you make this beautiful thing and like no one even reacts. Like I think a lot of us have had that experience, especially if you're like actively making stuff as an adult. It's sort of like you send it out and then like nothing.
And nobody cares.
And nobody cares, or nobody wants to take a chance on it or whatever it is. So sometimes it's criticism, sometimes it's silence, or just like people just like moving on, or sometimes, I was thinking about this too, and it's not always, I think, an artistic project, Sometimes as an adult, it's even like a work presentation or an idea, I had an experience one time early in my career. I was working in a nonprofit and I like gave an idea in a meeting, and like an older person like restated my idea, and then everyone was like, that's a great idea, So like when someone kind of like, takes your idea in a meeting, like I feel like that's also a creative wound, It's like you had this idea and somebody else kind of stepped all over it or laughed at it or whatever it might be. And I think that, we start building these like defense mechanisms against being hurt in the same way again. And so there are parts of us that are like 7 years old and your classmates like laughing at this picture that you drew. And then there are parts of us that are, 27 or 47, and had an experience where, someone made fun of you, or again, there was silence or whatever it might be. And it's sort of, there's just these layers that build up that try to defend you. And then it's harder to access the creativity that's underneath.
Got it. So that I think a lot of people will be able to relate to in some way or another. What does the process of healing those wounds look like, and how is that sort of unique to the way you see it? And also even how is that different from therapy? Why don't people just go talk about that in therapy?
Yeah, well, I think you could go talk about it in therapy, So I think that this is a place where, and I want to say also that I am not like a trained trauma healing practitioner. I've done a lot of trauma healing of my own, and like sort of I've been through the experience kind of as a client or like a participant. And I'm very clear, like when I work with people, like I'm not a therapist, I'm not like certified. And also, there's a lot of tools that I know that are really useful for people. So I want to say that right up front. And the other thing that I say to people who come, who want to be my client, is like, it's often really helpful, especially if they're also writing about trauma, So again, I think there's creative wounds and then there's wounds that we want to write about and like write through. And sometimes they're the same, but not always. A lot of times when people are wanting to process actual trauma, like big T trauma, through writing, I find it really supportive if they're also working with, a therapist or a counselor, or something of the kind, Because sometimes when you get into it, like with art, it can touch on things that then you need somebody who's kind of trained to hold space in that way to help you work through it. So in any case, one of the first things that I do with folks when we're working on creative wounds is literally we start with like a 5-minute timer and just like a list, like a brainstorm list of like, what are all the times you remember like making stuff and it wasn't received well, right? So this is everything from like your parent, like not hanging your picture on the fridge, right? To like some of the things that I was mentioning. I had a teacher in 2nd grade that I was terrified of. I actually have like probably like 70% of the people that come to write with me say that they had an English teacher at some point who told them they would never be a writer or their story was terrible or they should just stop writing altogether, right? So those obviously fall under like some of the big ones, but then there's also small ones, right? So we just do a brainstormed list of like, what are all the ones that you can remember? And we surface them. And we often do this in like a small group. And it can be really helpful to hear like the patterns of like, oh, like I really admire that person's writing. And they had the same, right? Their English teacher told them too, right? That they weren't a good enough writer or whatever it is. So I find that people hearing that reflection in a small group can also be really supportive of like, oh, it's not just me. It's not like I'm fatally flawed. Other people have had these experiences too. And then one thing that we do is sort of like choose anyone. It could be like the hardest moment or not. It could be any moment. And you just sort of imagine sitting with that version of yourself, whether it was like last week or 20 years ago. And you just sort of say like, hey, that wasn't okay. Like it wasn't okay for them to treat you that way, or it wasn't okay for them to say this. Like, how are you feeling? And maybe like almost like let that younger part of you be like, bah, like I hated that. They're so mean, right? Like whatever it is, just sort of like let them have their moment. And then just sort of like, depending again on how old the part of you is, like I sometimes have people like sit them almost like in your lap, like you can imagine, and just be like, it's okay. Like you're safe now. I'm going to take care of you. Right. And just sort of like having some of that like soothing. It's really powerful. And it's so interesting too, because practicing being that kind to another version of ourselves helps us practice being kind to like the current version of yourself that's trying to make something. It's really hard to make things.
Yeah.
I think the more compassion we can have, right, the more supportive it is.
When you sit down to write or create in any way and you start to feel that, it becomes actually a spotlight on everything else. It's a representation in some ways. It's just a one place where the way that you may feel about yourself, challenges that you have, that type of thing, is actually just kind of brought out into the open. Right.
Yeah.
So in some ways it's better. You know what? This hurts too much. As soon as I sit down, in that first thing, like my first sentence sucks. So why am I going to write another sentence?
Yeah.
No one's going to care. Or I finally get through and I hand it out and I was right. Nobody cares. Literally nobody cares, and so can that also be okay? Right. Like, you know what? I've written a bunch of stuff. You probably have too. I've made movies that like nobody's seen. So we got a movie that gets into a couple of little film festivals and you go and like, okay, 20 people showed up to this screening, 3 figures of people saw these little short film that I put a bunch of time and money and pulled in a bunch of favors and nobody cares. And then it's up online and, you get a couple hundred views or whatever. And eventually, and that's it. Is that okay? Like, why not be okay? Also, like, Catchlight happens to be a very good book, but Catchlight could have been terrible and it was still worth making for you, I think. But what do you think about that? Like, if someone's like, oh, it sucks. Like, okay, so what? Why is that a problem?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts about this. And one I will just say is, so thank you so much for thinking that Catchlight is a good book. And also, right, I had such big dreams for how many people would read it. And like, right, a few hundred people have read it. And I'm really proud of that. And also I'm like, wow, it took 7 years and like a few hundred people have read it. And it does become like, right, there was some creative, for me, there was some creative wounding around like, man, like I had dreams of it being like selling thousands of copies and whatever. And also like I got to a place where I was just like, you know what, like I'm really proud of it. I'm really proud of it. And it was the best work that I could possibly have done. And I know that it has touched people because they've told me so. And also, even if it didn't, right, like I feel like it taught me so much about being faithful to my own process and of like seeing things through to the end, right? Like, I feel like I learned so much just from the process of sitting down every day and doing it. And for me, that makes it worthwhile. And I think that it plays into this quote that I say all the time from Brene Brown. And she says, I heard her say in an interview once that unused creativity is not benign. And so this idea that when we have creativity that we don't use, like it can turn malignant, right? I see that all the time, right? I have people that come to me who have wanted to write a book for 10 years, sometimes like 30 years, and like still have not done it. And it's like they're stuck in so many places. And I'm like, if you would just write 200 freaking words a day, like who knows, like what else would open up for you, right? So I feel like I see that all the time when people start making what they're supposed to make, like other things happen that they could not have foreseen.
You know, there's something else too, I think that comes in that. I had a client at one point who is a similar situation. For 10 years, she'd wanted to write this book. And one of the things that I've found a lot of people hold people back is I'm worried about some outcome. Like even, you know, well, can I really write about this situation about somebody? It's like, at this point, nobody's like, it took you 7 years, you said, to write the book, and then another, 6 years you said before it got published. Yep. So 13 years, and 13 years, literally go ahead and just do whatever. By that time, that person who you're worried about slander is probably going to be dead. So who cares? So it's a little bit macabre, but you know, the reality is at a certain point, it doesn't matter. I was working with this woman, 10 years she'd wanted to write. We get together and we go, okay, we're going to commit to working together for a few months and can, you know, kickstart this, and then we'll see if we're going to, you know, what needs to happen afterwards. We worked for a few months. She was writing regularly, etc. And then she went on a vacation and she came back and I was like, okay, you know, do you want to sort of go into the next step or what's going on? And she says, you know, I've realized I don't want to write this book. And I think that is so like vital to me. That's one of actually it's one of my great success stories, because here was somebody who felt bad, who felt incomplete, who felt, as you said, like who felt that unused creativity was malignant. But it actually, what it was I need to do this to find out that actually that's not what I want to do. But that's in blocking my way to get to the next thing. So if you don't even start doing it, you might start writing it and be like, oh, I really want to do this. And until you get to the point where you say, you know what, I don't want to do it, either finish or get to the point where you're like that, I'm putting it in the back drawer, or I'm even shredding it. One of the two. You can put it in the back drawer to be like, when I move or when I'm, you know, have absolutely nothing else to do, maybe I can go look in the back of that drawer. But in general, like when you get there, and I think most people, and probably earlier on in my consulting work, I might have felt like, oh shoot, that was a failure. And eventually I realized that was now a great success. You know, that whole burden. And you would also mention this too, this thing if sometimes people are actually writing about trauma, in this case, that was a situation, was where does the healing need to happen? Like you might need to say, I'm going to write a book about it because you believe that by spending time in that situation, you can do healing. And in this person's situation, the healing happened in about 3 months of sitting there and writing and just going through, wait a second, I've been so traumatized by this, but it's just my story. Like my story can either be like bad or fine or even good. Where am I putting my focus in that particular story? Because no matter how bad your life has been or how bad your story is, there's infinite number of precious moments. Yeah. Right. And we'll tend to go to the dark ones if we're feeling dark. And if someone's like me, I forget bad things that happen. Like the next day, I'm like, wait, my life's perfect, isn't it? Because I don't remember anything bad happening just because I don't have a memory for it for whatever reason. There's probably you could psychoanalyze that one, I'm sure. Anyway, in your work too, right? Where do you see that fitting in that way?
So I had a client who came to my first in-person retreat, which, get this, happened in February of 2020. Okay, yeah. There you go, under the wire. So she started writing a book about trauma, and you know, and I met up with her just on Zoom, like maybe 6 months later. And I said, how's it going? And she was just like, you know, when the pandemic started, like I really could not sit down and write about my own trauma anymore. It's just like too heavy. And so like, I stopped writing, and I took it in for a moment. And I just said, like, if you could write about anything, what would you write about? She got really quiet and she was like, I would write this like steampunk, like mystery, and it would be like time travel and like, right, like, and it would be like a love story. And I was like, well, that's different, right? And she had this idea, and she said, she was like, I had this conception of myself that I was like an academic writer, and I was going to do all this research and tie it in with my personal story, and like that was how I would add value like to the world or to the conversation. And she was like, but actually, and I was saying like, there's so much value in like novels that entertain and like stories that are like fun to read. Like we need that. And like, it's so clear, like in the world now, like we need that. And so she just like happily like traveled on and started writing this really cool, like dual timeline book. And yeah, it was just so interesting to me that like, we think that, like you said, like we have to write something very serious. And then it turned out that she wanted to write something much lighter. And that was perfect.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Brooke, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. Your book, Catchlight, I know it's available on Amazon, and I'm hoping that if you just type in Catchlight, Brooke Adams Law, you'll be able to find it. Also in the show notes, we'll put a link to a place or places where the book can be purchased. And also let us know, Brooke, where, if somebody wanted to work with you or learn more about your creative trauma healing work, where can we find you?
Yeah, so you can find me at my website, which is brookeadamslaw.com, Brooke with an E on the end. And I'm also on Instagram, and it's Brooke Adams Law _author. So I do a lot of teaching on Instagram about trauma healing and how to use that in your writing process. And yeah, but all the stuff about how to work with me is on my website.
Okay, very good. Well, we'll have also a link in the show notes or down below in the section. So again, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure having you, and I am looking forward to finishing Catchlight, which shouldn't be too much longer down the road. And yeah, thanks again. This was great.
Yay, thank you.